once again, we have the privilege of being with John Wheeler as he expresses from nowhere and no thing what is real and what is not real, so to speak. And one of the questions that I've gotten quite a lot, and I have my own take on it, but I'd much rather hear yours, is that people say they're a bit befuddled by the couple of notions. One, that they hear some say that they point to, I think it's the Buddhist Heart Sutra, that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And they hear that, and I think they're trying to kind of figure it out. And then another pointer that Sailor Bob Adamson used, which made a huge difference when he shared that with me, is that the question, can something come from no thing? So maybe we could address that.
Well, we could give it a try and see what comes up. And the first thing I always like to start with that kind of levels the field, and that is that all pointers and all phrases and ideas are clearly conceptual. And, we don't want to turn them into absolutes or think that if working with that concept and figuring out that concept is somehow going to get us to the essential clarity that this is really about. So, because there are many, hundreds and thousands of pointers and different topics and things that have been discussed through the ages. And they're all fine and they're all interesting, but what I'm more concerned about is that, we're using them, if we do use them, to keep us on target with what is very, very essential. So we can debate what is form, what is emptiness, what does it mean, and so on and so forth. But in essence, that activity has very little to do with what I think that we're really pointing to here, which is what is the nature of your being. I mean, right. That being that's here is a factual experience. It's a doubtless something that is present. Everybody knows that they are, and what we're really doing always is we're looking at that and being clear on that. So it's very easy to go far afield and suddenly get lost in all of these subtle philosophical issues, and I just want to raise that flag there, that we make sure that we don't inadvertently end up doing that, thinking, well, that has something to do with knowing who I am. I really don't feel there is necessarily a connection there.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And, my own 1 minute on that would be, well, look, isn't that all just mental noise that comes and goes in the clear presence of awareness that you are?
Yeah, and it all depends on, for example, what does somebody even mean by form? What do they even mean by emptiness? What do they even mean by their terms? And one thing that we don't want to do is have a discussion with ourselves or with others where haven't even clarified precisely what it is that we're even speaking about. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope there. So, I don't know what Buddha meant, or Nagarjuna or somebody, exactly what they had in mind when they used that word emptiness. Maybe we can guess at it, we can have our own interpretations and so on, but, probably the best thing that we can do is to come back to our immediate experience and see how it looks for us. And, I think that what this particular issue may be getting to is, what is the nature of appearance? And, in relation to who we are, or in relation to what we're pointing to. And that's a discussion, or that's a looking that we can do now and go by direct evidence on how it looks for us. And that was one of the questions that came up for me when I was talking with Sailor Bob at one point, was, well, what is all this stuff? What is the nature of all of this stuff that we are perceiving? Because, one of the main thrusts of this is looking at who you are and looking at the fact of your being, and I feel that really that is the most important part of it. And yet at one point it did arise for me, even as that was becoming clear, was, yeah, but what about this appearance that we see, that we interact with, what is the nature of that, in relation to what we're discussing? And that may be a important thing, or at least something that comes up. It certainly did for me.
Yeah. Same here. And so this kind of, this body and this world certainly appear to be solid, and they certainly appear to be real. And so what is, I like what you said, what is the nature of all this stuff? What's it made of? What is it?
And one of the things that I think we're often doing in this approach to spirituality is we're trying to understand by looking a little more deeply at things, whether it's ourself or the mind or the appearance. We're kind of taking a step back and looking at it from a broader view. Now, one of the things that comes up when I look at this, and when I talk about this, is that all of the appearance, one of the things that we can all see right now is all of the appearances, from the thoughts and feelings and body and these objects and all of these things that we can experience are appearing in our consciousness. They are appearing as objects being known in this principle of consciousness. And that would be a very, I think a pretty safe and pretty inclusive statement. So we can start to speak of, going on direct experience, we can see immediately that everything that we can discuss, no matter what it might be, is going to be an appearance in consciousness, and that's an important insight. And it starts to give us a way of understanding what the appearances might be. Well, they arise and set in this consciousness in which they appear, and that's a real powerful pointer. It's a very all-encompassing insight there, because you can start to see things then, for example, like the experience of these appearances is not separate from that consciousness itself. Nobody experiences a thought or a feeling or a sensation or an object. Nobody experiences any of those as independent of that principle of consciousness. So we start to get a deeper view of what's going on, and that that may be enough in terms of, and that was actually what was shared with me, and I think it's a kind of a comprehensive view, and that is the appearances are just appearances in and of that.
Mm-hmm.
They are that consciousness, because they're not really experienced as independent, and so if all of these appearances are not ever experienced in direct evidence as being separate from that, then they must be that in essence. And that, I think that's about the essence of it, how it was pointed to me in terms of the curiosity I had about that.
Yeah.
So these things are a display in consciousness. They're an appearance of that. They're a manifestation of that. They are not to be looked at as independent or somehow substantial, standing apart from that. And so it's a reducing it's a reducing of the things back to the essence, back to what is more real or more true or more lasting, and that is, we can also see now how all of these appearances are constantly changing, how they're impermanent, how they're coming and going within that greater reality of the consciousness in which they appear. So, and that may be, depending. I mean, that could be a sufficient pointer just on its own right there.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that without consciousness, nothing could appear at all.
Yeah, and then what happens really is it gets us back to the core, and that is, then once we realize that these appearances don't have an independent nature, and that consciousness itself is the substratum or the main principle, then it brings our attention back to exploring and looking at the consciousness itself, because that's the key fundamental aspect. And sometimes I've actually, when I've talked about this, one way of thinking about non-duality could be, phrased as the exploration or the investigation of the nature of consciousness. That's one way that we could think of what are we doing, in this investigation. We're looking into that essence or that reality, which is the basis of all of our experiencing, and one of the ways that we can look at that is realizing that basis is consciousness itself. So, and
then really getting curious about, okay, what is this consciousness?
Exactly. What is consciousness, and what am I, in relation to that? Where do I stand? And it's a very fascinating and just a very fruitful investigation, because it's getting to the very core of our experience, of our very existence itself, and that's really what non-duality has always been getting to, which is the direct investigation of who we are, and so this looking at consciousness really turns out to be a doorway into that same investigation, because when we start to look at consciousness, we're getting very, very much back to the core of what we actually are. And as some of the traditions tell us, and we can see that there is something about who we are that has this consciousness aspect that's very, very key to our identity. And not only do we know that we are present, we have an existence, but if we look right now in our experience, we see that there's a consciousness aspect to that. I'm not inert, unconscious. I'm actually, alive and sentient and cognizing and registering, and so clearly that consciousness aspect is very, very essential to what I am. And so that's why this looking into appearances really gets us back to recognizing the primacy of the consciousness itself, and then as we're looking at that, we're getting very, very close to the essence of who we are.
The essence of who we are being something that's beyond any description, and at the same time it's palpable and alive, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And there's always that dance between the reality, whatever it might be. In this case, talking about ourselves, and then the description.
Mm-hmm.
And we've covered that in one of the other talks about the inadequacy of concepts and words and labels to actually capture or describe the living reality of what is present. So it's very fascinating to realize that it's very, very important, I think. There's no, in this moment, there is no doubt whatsoever of our existence. That there's no question about that, and so that's why that what is being pointed to is already present. That's why there doesn't have to be an attainment or an arrival at a future date or some kind of process or some kind of approach to who we are, because everybody knows out of the gate from the start that fact is nailed down. It's very, very secure and certain. And so what we're actually doing is we're just fine-tuning and looking at that which we already know is present, so that there's no confusion about that. And one of the biggest confusions that we've had is assuming that the label or the description actually is the thing itself. And so we want to be very clear on the distinction that just these words that might be used, whatever they might be, are clearly not the essence itself.
Bob said the word is not the thing, the map is not the territory.
Yeah, and that's why we don't want to get too attached or too fixated on the descriptions. And, clearly across the traditions and whoever may be speaking about this, there's going to be any number of words and terms and descriptions, and those can more and more can be invented. Everybody that looks at this could potentially invent some new label, so we don't want to get too much into a kind of a view that's saying, well, is this the right label? Is this one better? Or is this one worse, because we're just we're comparing labels. We're comparing descriptions, and we don't want to get too invested in the labels or descriptions. We want to be more involved in actually looking at what is real, at what is present, and so that's the difference. Because if we look at the descriptions and we start comparing and looking at traditions and philosophies and religions and what did people say, I mean, clearly we're dealing at a mental level, at a conceptual level.
And we need a really clear distinction, which has been made in the earlier podcasts for sure. So someone listening to this who hasn't heard those might want to go back to those. But a clear distinction between the concept of something and the actuality of it. The word being is not being.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is an important distinction, and that the clarity of that to see that language at best can point and at worst can obscure this clear presence we're talking about and pointing to. Yes?
Yes, yeah. So, and the interesting thing that we see with this is the answer, so to speak, or the reality of what this is all about is very, very simple and obvious, and it's quite inescapable and very, very clear, because it's really nothing more than your presence itself, than just being, being here, knowing that I am, that naked fact itself. Mm-hmm. Just that sheer fact itself is what this is.
Yeah.
And the labeling and the discussions and the pointers and all that are coming on top of that. They're coming after that fact. And so that in itself, if we really understand that what is being pointed to is that presence or that reality prior to the conceptualizing, then I think it'll be very clear, and we won't get confused or kind of wrapped up in the labeling itself. We'll say, well, wait a minute, that this labeling is an appearance coming and going in the truth of what I actually am without the label.
Clear and evident here that which we are is absolutely permanent. That everything else is temporal, but that what we are is totally permanent. It never moves.
Yeah, and we see that on direct evidence. We see that by looking and just intuition, just introspecting and noticing what is the nature of what I am. We see, like you say, we see these thoughts and experiences, they're arising and setting, and then we just look directly at this fact of our own being, and just, what is it doing? Is it coming and going? No. Is it changing? No. Is it a thought arising and setting before, my consciousness? No.
The paradox being that everything is made of that same essence.
Because as we saw at the start, these appearances they're not outside of that. They're not independent of that. And they can't really be separated from that, see. So we don't want to start conceptualizing as if there was some inherent difference.
Mm.
It's a little bit of a paradox, because what happens is that as a way of getting clear on this and really coming face to face with that naked awareness itself, sometimes what we're doing is we're saying it's not this, it's not this. And, we're kind of discarding or negating some of these appearances. And sometimes people feel or say, well, isn't that a duality? Aren't you making a distinction between the pure awareness and these objects? And you're saying those objects are not the awareness. But it's really just it's a pointer that's used so that we don't get fixated on only the appearance
mm-hmm.
and miss the substratum. So we want to, it would be like if you were out looking at the ocean and the waves were, on top and rippling through, and somebody was saying, where is this ocean? I don't see the ocean. All I see is these waves. And so you might say, those waves are not it. Those waves are just coming and going. There is something, there's a substratum there. And so there would be a way you would be negating these appearances so that you could recognize the essence. But obviously when you see what's there and you recognize what the ocean actually is, then you realize that these waves are not an independent reality either, and the waves are that ocean in essence. So the distinction between awareness and objects is only a tool, it's only a temporary pointer to highlight that unchanging essence that is the substratum of things. And then we're going to then look back from that and realize that all of the appearances are included in that and not to be separated from that. So we are not actually making a duality or making an artificial distinction, but we are using that pointer temporarily to get to the essence of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that pointer itself is just a temporary concept. I mean, all of these pointers and discussions and things that are described are themselves concepts, but the difference is that we now know that, we see that. We're not taking those concepts as the reality. So it's a little bit seemingly kind of confusing, because on the one hand, we're talking about how the concepts are not that reality. And yet when we actually get to that essential reality, it becomes clear that all of the appearances, including the concepts, are in fact just the one essence. So sometimes that throws people off a little bit. So we have to understand how that's being used.
That's beautiful, and it reminds me of one of the things that's been said along the way, is that, you can't kind of leap over tall buildings at a single bound here. You kind of got to go through in a manner of speaking, go through the steps of this. You can't just jump to the end without seeing the middle, isn't it?
Yeah, just to see the intent. It's important to see the reason behind the pointers. I mean, pointers are just, it's like a toolbox, okay? So you've got a toolbox filled with all these instruments and hammer, saw, screwdriver, all these things. And they're just inert. They're not good, bad, they're not useful, they're not, unuseful. They're just practical things, and they may come into play with some value at some time if somebody uses them in a certain circumstance. And it's the same way with all these spiritual pointers. They're just, in and of themselves, they're just insentient tools that may or may not have any benefit. And often what we actually see in spirituality is they can become just as much a part of the problem as being a solution. So, we could go out, for example, and study non-duality, study religion, study philosophy, and essentially loading up on a whole toolbox full of all kinds of tools, very complicated concepts and things like that.
Yeah.
If we don't understand the essence and the whole purpose of this whole endeavor, we could get lost in those concepts and be thinking that, gee, I've got to figure out what all these concepts mean and how they fit together, and it's going to take years of study and we're all that kind of thing, which is going in the opposite direction.
Or worse yet, to take the concept as truth, and now I know the truth, and you don't, and here's the truth, and it's just a bunch of concepts.
Yeah, they used to talk about the pride of knowledge, saying, look at me, I've got all this special knowledge and all these concepts and all this incredible information that makes me special or different or more insightful, and that starts inflating this artificial sense of self.
Mm-hmm. Insight I had where I was driving along one day, and it suddenly dawned on me that never in my life had I ever had an original thought. It was all learned. It all came from outside. None of it was inherently real. The whole story was inherently a fiction.
So, again, form and emptiness and these things, again, it really depends on how that was used and what people meant. But, I mean, clearly these appearances are arising and setting in that conscious nature itself. Now, when we look at the nature of what I am, we're going to find very rapidly that that's not a thing.
Right.
It's not something that you can grasp. It's not an object, and you hear those words like no thing or emptiness, and or however they describe that, and that's just one of those pointers to describe this nature of the essence of our true being, is that no thingness. It's that empty presence. It's that space-like awareness itself. Now, so that could be one way of looking at the emptiness pointer. And then you realize that the appearances, they are really one ultimately in essence. Getting back to this emptiness and form, now, I don't know exactly how somebody conceived those terms and what they were getting at, but we were talking about how this true nature that we are is no thing. So it's not an object. It's not a substantial thing that we can grasp a hold of, and that's where you get some of these pointers can come in, where they're talking about no thing, or that emptiness, or that space-like awareness. So, and we have seen in just the talk that we've had so far, is that these forms, these appearances, these objects that we do experience are actually not independent from that. So they're not separate. They cannot really ultimately be divided from that. So that would be one way of approaching that, where, when they say that these forms are that emptiness. So it's a pulling away the artificial duality, as if these appearances and the aware nature were actually somehow conceptually divided, and we're seeing that that's not true. So that might be one of the ways, perhaps, that such a pointer was used. I mean, there's probably other ways, other approaches on that same pointer. Because one of the insights that I've had about that is that the form and the emptiness are just two sides of a conceptual duality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, clearly when I'm talking about form and emptiness, those are concepts. And they could be looked at from that perspective as a dualistic concept, and something simply created in thought, and then realizing that what I actually am is prior to both the form and the emptiness. Because, that concept of form and emptiness is conceived in the conceptualizing process, but what I am is actually prior to that. So that'd be another way of looking at that, to say that, these conceptual dualities get resolved ultimately back in the essence which is prior to both of them, and so this reality is not to be defined in either end of a duality.
Yeah.
And so that would be a little bit different way. So you kind of see that even using the pointers depends on where you start from and what your intent is.
And all pointers ultimately are kind of surrendered or given up, or however you want to say it. They just kind of go away. Well, they become at the end game. The pointers for me just became irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, when you realize that the pointers are appearances and they're very provisional, and what you are is not defined by any of them, then the interest and the exclusive focus on them drops out of the picture. I mean, why do I need to be interested in labels and descriptions when I know that clearly that none of those is what I am? And then at that point we may use pointers for communication.
Mm-hmm.
But we're no longer looking for our reality or that sense of identity or who we are or searching for happiness, puzzling through all of these provisional pointers. And that's a pretty losing battle that we've probably been through over many years. Like, what is the correct description? What is the correct pointer? What is the correct teaching? And none of them are ultimate. So who really cares from that perspective once we see that? And then we can use any of these pointers, or maybe we can make up our own pointers, or come up with some other way of describing things.
Right. Yeah. There's no limit on what can be invented out of nothing, is there?
That's true. Yeah. So the pointers are actually infinite, and that's why if we start to say, well, what's the right pointer, or this is the right description, then somebody comes along and invents, something new, and then we're thinking, oh wow, do I have to figure that one out?
Yeah.
But if you just see that the description is not what is described, then you step out of that, and.
Yeah, that's a really key in this, is to see that the description is not inherently valid or meaningful at all. It's because you can't really describe what you are, and yet you know that you are.
Yeah, and then what you can do is you can slip out of the labeling process itself, let the mind be, let the conceptualizing relax, and just kind of tune in and notice what is, and notice what is present. And there's a very interesting experience with that, because, like you say, we're not talking about a vacuum or some void that is just some imagined thing. I mean, the reality of my presence, the truth of my being and what I am is here. It's in it. It's all of its immediacy, and we can let the attention come off the labeling just to simply notice what is present, and that's really what we're doing, and we'll start to be, and that's when we shift over from trying to grasp it in a concept and then really looking in a non-conceptual, immediate, direct experience. What is the nature of what is here? And what we'll see is that this is what people have been pointing to. They've been trying to describe this through whatever words that they came up with. But the key distinction is they were looking directly at this in immediate experience, and in that living, direct knowing of this, then coming out of that with trying to put it in language that would hopefully express that. And that's the difference between studying and accumulating concepts and speaking while standing as that reality. And it's night and day. There's absolutely no comparison between those two. One is alive, one is carrying that resonance, one is expressing the quality of that living truth, and then the other is just basically hashing over stale concepts, somebody else's description. And I think that we can appreciate and kind of tune in and perceive that difference.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing that's interesting about that is they may be the same words, but the energy or the reality that's informing those words is completely different, and that's something that we can notice. I mean, it's just the difference between whether we understand what the concept is standing for and experience that, or whether we're just simply stating a concept that, like you say, that we just picked up somewhere, we just acquired some concept.
Yeah, exactly.
I used to have a thing in some of those traditions where they say, you could teach a parrot to say, I am that. I am that, I am that, I am that. It could learn that.
Yeah.
But didn't really know what it was saying. It didn't understand what that meant.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you took the word out of my mouth. I was going to mention parroting. Yeah. And it's so simple and so real. I mean, it's just so real. I think I mentioned one time when we were talking about something that Ralph Waldo Emerson said about who you are speaks so loudly I don't even hear the words. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's when this expression is palpable and valid and potent and real, is when it's clearly coming out of that space of being the space-like awareness that is standing as that. Not even, you can't say standing in that, because that would be a duality. It's standing as that. And
yeah, and the good. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that it should be really clear by now that you, Sailor Bob, and a very small handful of others stand as that and express from that. It's the old expression, where you're coming from. And
Yeah.
when you're coming from this direct, absolute knowing, doubtless, clear knowing, then something is communicated which is outside of the normal modes of communication, which would normally be a person talking to another person trying to learn something or explain something, but rather it's a, well, how does Bob put it? I'm not speaking to any body, I'm not speaking to any mind, I'm speaking to the I am that I am. And it's just clear here that the expression, when it comes out of that, has a whole different taste, a different flavor, a different potency to it. It's really heart to heart.
Yeah, and as you know, I mean, we're what we're always saying, and what has been shared with us and throughout all these traditions, is that everyone is standing as that. Everyone is that, and there's nobody that is not that. But so we're just, these pointers and things are just simply trying to highlight and remind and cause us to appreciate and recognize that fact. So, and people don't often realize it's just a little bit of a pointing. I mean, these kinds of teachings and what is going on and clarifying this essential experience is a very small, kind of a micro adjustment. It's a very small pointing. It's just a correction of an erroneous notion. And as we've talked about, this notion that I stand apart from that being, that I stand separate from that space-like awareness, that idea, that single idea, is that base concept. It's that fundamental root notion, and a lot of things might spin from that. I mean, because once you grant the reality of the separate I, then that separate I can suddenly have all of these other concepts and ideas, but they always have to start with that I am, and then some description of that I thought. And so, and those, just like labeling, that process can go on and can expand out and grow and all that. But when you actually realize that, when you get down to the essence of it, the beginning of that tree of conceptualizing is actually just simply that one single notion itself. And so what this pointing really gets down to is, it gets down to shining the light right on that assumption to see if it's true that this sense of being present that we are, if that is to be equated with that notion. So, I mean, you could look at this whole endeavor, this whole thing, as simply clarifying the reality of a single concept.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I look directly at the core of that and I realize that concept, like everything else, comes and goes in the abiding truth of what I am, which turns out to be that non-conceptual, immediate awareness or pure being itself. Just the clarification on that one point there is enough to allow us to recognize that we have never been anything other than that at any time, even when we didn't seemingly recognize it, or whatever the idea might have been. Even then, whatever was going on was still just an appearance in the truth of what we have always been. And that's why there doesn't even have to be some special experience, because what happens is even those things get turned into concepts, and then we start chasing the concepts again. We don't have to have some fancy spiritual term and label it with some exotic, statement, whatever it might be, as this is, I got this, whatever it might be, some special experience. That's way too much thinking, way too much conceptualizing. It's just,
sure, yeah, it's like trying to turn on a light bulb that's already brightly burning, isn't it?
Yeah. And, yeah. So, nobody is, your being doesn't need to attain itself, and so on. And, even like I've said before, but this awakening is a redundancy, because the natural being that nobody is outside of is radiantly awake, absolutely vividly cognizant and clear, and it is that space-like emptiness that has always been pointed to, and here you are as that. So the idea that I would awaken is just, it's a complete redundant concept. And even though it sounds very, kind of spiritual and all that, but even something like that puts another concept on the natural sense of reality that's here. Why not just, pause all the thinking, all the spiritual concepts, and just look right now and realize that I am this wakefulness.
I am.
Yeah. And that's
even,
just a pointer.
Sure, even before words say I am.
Exactly. So with or without the word, that knowing, being, presence is here. And, that's, it's just always coming back to hammering on that and just emphasizing that point and saying in so many different ways that's already present, that there is no duality, there is no separation. That is present. It cannot be doubted, cannot be denied, needs no condition, needs no attainment, needs no process, needs nothing added or put on top of that. Because
already
it's simply
whole and complete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you are that. And so these are just all different ways it keeps revolving back again and again and again to this sheer fact of this doubtless reality that no one has ever been separated from as much as an instant. Because, how could you be separate from your existence?
Mm-hmm.
If you were separate from your existence, you wouldn't be there.
Well, the whole idea just kind of makes me smile now,
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about this is the experience of daily living.
Mm-hmm.
Just the experience of the body being alive in the world, so to speak, is the closest I could come is it's kind of like just smiling at nothing. Smiling for no reason. There's a sense of all rightness about the whole play.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way you put it once is it's the peace of nothing wrong. And that
Yes.
to me, that really says it. It's the peace of nothing wrong.
Somebody, along these lines, somebody had brought this question up with Nisargadatta Maharaj, as I understand it, which was asking him, how would he describe this state or this experience? And I always remember he said a couple of things. The first thing he said was that he couldn't really explain it, but all he knew was that there was nothing wrong anymore. And I got to thinking about that at some point, and I was realizing that and noticing how beautiful that description really is.
Mm-hmm.
Because starting out with this a statement that I can't actually verbalize that, I cannot really describe it, which is exactly what we've been saying, is that this reality is not a concept. So there's nothing that we can say that will capture that, okay?
Yeah.
But then just that one little final statement that, there's just nothing wrong anymore. And I always felt, for me, as I was thinking about this, that was probably the best explanation or the most profound statement I'd ever heard.
Yeah, you betcha.
Because, you look at life and you look at what we normally go through and the problems and the worries and the doubts, and there's always something wrong. Even if we're a spiritual seeker, we're not quite there yet. We may have had the awakening, but we're not stabilized in it yet, or we're trying to live the teaching or whatever we're doing. And there's always a little note in there that something is not complete. There's just a little bit more. But to just have this simple knowing just across the board that there is literally nothing wrong anymore. It's just such an amazing pointer, really.
And the truth, it being the truth of who you are, is that there's nothing wrong.
Yeah, there is nothing wrong.
Who I am is there's nothing wrong. It's in language.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think you expressed it very nicely, to just have this inner smile of for no particular reason.
Yeah.
Isn't that, basically saying that there's nothing to get caught up in. There's nothing to frown about anymore. There's just that basic everything's all right.
Exactly.
And that's I think that if people are wondering, well, what is this about, or what's the experience, or okay, we talk about all these pointers and we look at this and that and we have interviews and write all this stuff, but what does it really get down to in the end? And it gets down to the complete, total, absolute resolution of suffering and problems and personal doubts and worries. These are all absolutely resolved and addressed through the kinds of things that we're pointing to.
Absolutely.
And that's the most wonderful, I think, incredible message. Talk about to me, just what that really means to think about, because everyone in their own way is trying to achieve happiness and overcome their suffering and fix their problems and stuff. And what this is basically saying is that is possible.
Absolutely. Plenty of people who are living testament to that fact. The fact that there's nothing wrong with being.
Exactly. Because, what is wrong with being? Think about it. What is wrong? What could you say was wrong with being? It just doesn't even make any sense.
Well, first you'd have to invent some words and tell a story about being, being is beyond the story.
And then you're conceptualizing.
Exactly. So. Yeah. Well, what was it Bob said? Sailor Bob said, what's wrong with right now unless you're thinking about it?
Yep. Yeah, that's one of those potent statements that contains everything. It contains the whole essence of everything. If you take a simple statement like that and you break it apart and you examine what it's getting at, that has the whole description of where suffering comes from, which is in the conceptualizing, and then it has the whole positive side about when the energy is not going into that conceptualizing. The simple description of what that state or what that nature is, which is nothing wrong. So that simple statement has everything we've covered in we've been talking about this, the positive truth about what you are, what is the nature of that reality, and then looking at the nature of suffering and the root cause. That statement actually has the complete answer to both pieces.
It does.
So what's wrong with right now unless you think about it?
It does.
And that's why, I think my advice in non-duality is take some real simple, comprehensive point like that and really look at that and see if you can get grasp the essence that's being communicated. What is the experience behind that pointer? Where did that pointer come from? What was the wisdom? What was the knowledge and experience that was the source of that pointer? And you're going to find that source from where that pointer came from is this unconditioned reality itself, that you are that right now. So you can take any one of those pointers and they will lead you back immediately, very, very directly to the essential reality. And that's why you don't need, a million pointers. And sometimes people talk to me, well, what did they mean by this? What did they mean by this? What does that pointer mean? And so on. And it starts to get confusing, but, they don't realize often that they don't need to know all that.
Yeah.
You just take one direct, simple pointer that rings, that really resonates and that you feel intuitively is getting to the essence, and you just follow that and see the truth of it.
Dig down source of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's going to lead you right to the living waters. There's a Southern Nisargadatta quote from him that he says, you don't have to dig a bunch of pits all over the place. If you're looking for water, you find the water and you dig deep and you go deep. You go to the essence.
Dig in one spot. Don't be putting a bunch of potholes in the lawn.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't, we just take a basic pointer and what that is in line with the basics of this, and then just and follow it and see what it means, and most importantly, trace it to its source, which is what from where that pointer emerges, and then you're going to be as you said, standing as that reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you are that reality. You'll see that reality is what you presently actually are. So you can have fun with the pointers as long as you realize that what they're pointing at and follow them, to the essence.
Well, I like what you said about, taking one or two that really kind of ring the bell for you and following them back to their source. And then it's all...
That's all that's needed.
Yeah.
I've often really felt, and when I look back at how this was pointed out to me, I mean, there was, 4 or 5 key points, if that much, but just some real nuggets, some real gems there that, and we don't want to go on a hunt, for pointers, collecting pointers and statements and becoming a master of, what do they say,
we don't
master of all.
Collect pointers like little glass figurines or something.
Yeah, because, you could become a scholar, you could become a master of all these things and be able to lecture and categorize all the different pointers and traditions and all that, but you could very well actually not know who you are.
Yeah, you can write the book of 14 million pointers of 10,000 years of this or that. And what you end up with is a doorstop.
Exactly. Or, you can see the potential of what's available, and which is, the resolution of suffering and seeking, and this kind of direct knowing of who we are, and then take a pointer and that rings and really digest it and make it your own and see what's being pointed at, and then you'll be just with that alone, you'll be beyond the need of any of the other pointers.
Yeah.
And, and even if somebody comes along who is using pointers and, talking about different traditions and categorizing things and saying this and that, they can't really give you or reveal to you anything more than what your direct experience already is.
Exactly.
So this is not a game of intellectually consuming and, arguing about pointers or becoming an expert in that by any means. It's very important. I think, and we started, talking about that, the difference between the concept or the word and the actual thing that it's pointing to. And I think we can see that now and appreciate why that is so important.
Yeah, and anyone can see it right now, right here.
Exactly.
Because it's who everyone already is. So, where's any problem unless there's a concept that's been taken on board to be some false reality. There is no separate reality. There's just reality.
Yeah, beautifully said. It's always, pause the concept and see what's present. And then we'll see, one thing that just to round this out so it doesn't become, again, kind of somehow start to make a sense of duality or something like that between, reality and the concept. But the thing is, you realize then when you see what is present, then you see that remains as it is with or without the concept.
Yeah.
So the concept then is not any kind of a distraction, or it doesn't impair the nature of what is present, and it doesn't disturb the truth of what you are. So then it becomes, there's a lot of freedom from that position, because you don't have to try to, for example, push away concepts or do some artificial dance around, what's the proper concept, or is this the acceptable, I should say this, I shouldn't say that, and, all those kind of artificial games that we might, put energy into. We're free then to use all of these expressions in whatever way comes up naturally without any division.
Yes.
But there's just a difference now in the view. There's a different experience. And the difference is that before this, we were assuming that the concepts were the only game in town, that those concepts were the reality, and it was seemingly very important to figure that out and which is the right one and all that stuff. But now we're seeing the source or the essence of the concepts, and then suddenly becoming liberated and very free to use or not use the concepts in any particular way that might suit the circumstance. Like an expert, repairman or something. He can use any tool in the box under a certain circumstance when it's appropriate, but he's not limited by that. He's not somehow hampered by that.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a fluidity in that, and life just becomes, as you were saying, it becomes a spontaneous, naturally joyful, very light kind of expression, and it's hard to describe that. I know I certainly, when you were describing that, it gave me a sense of what you were getting at there. So I hope that's something that people pick up.
It's kind of the bottom line of it, because why else would anyone have ever gone into some notions of spirituality or Advaita or anything else, except to discover the natural truth of the peace of nothing wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And, to discover the source of happiness, the source of joy. Why else would we have bothered? So why not take it? Because it's here. And,
exactly.
Being already that, there's nothing to take and nowhere to go, and just see it directly, immediately, here and now. That's the beauty of this expression to me.
Yeah, and I hope that's what, gives people listening a sense of this and allows it to resonate and that they can recognize what's being pointed to. Just like there was a time when what we're talking about was not clear for me at all. I mean, it wasn't remotely even clear. And there was a lot of suffering and seeking, and even though I had been deeply into spirituality and things, but these basic points were still eluding me until someone pointed it out very, very simply and directly.
It's kind of like just turning around and noticing the ocean when you've just been facing away from it. So once it's pointed to, it's obvious. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, I was using that example where you're looking at the waves and then you're puzzling, wondering where is the ocean, and you think that there's some other separate ocean somewhere, and you're saying, all I see are the waves. And then somebody kind of smacks you in the head and says, "Hey, look, look at what these waves are made out of," or something like that. And it's here, it's now, look, don't go running around conceptualizing, stop and look. And it just that simplicity, it just suddenly dawns on you that you've been looking at it the whole time.
Yeah.
And is there anybody listening to this podcast right now, whoever they may be, that can actually claim that they aren't present and aware? And that's what we're trying to highlight, that fact.
Any claim of not being present and aware requires presence and awareness.
Yeah, and that was something that simple, that essential point is what just needs to be reminded, because, and that's what I did see at one point is the simple question of, do you know that you are? And so that is another that's probably the most direct, simplest, and most kind of naked, immediate pointer that you could possibly contemplate or think about.
To understand that you are, and you know that you are, and that's all that's being pointed to, and it's that simplicity and that obviousness that was only missed because it wasn't clearly pointed out to us, hey?
Yeah, and that which is being recognized, when we know that we are, whatever that might be, is what this is.
Yeah, exactly.
And that, and then you realize that is the naked awareness. That is the non-conceptual awareness. That is the pure being. That is the emptiness. That is this timeless, spaceless, no thing, bodiless, mindless, all the rest of that stuff. That's what that is. Oh, okay. It's like, wow, isn't that interesting? And I remember when this got pointed out to me, and it rang, and it resonated, and I had an intuition there that this really is what it's always been about. I knew that.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I remember having this image in my mind of like stumbling into Fort Knox, kind of suddenly the treasure is there.
Mm.
you've been seeking, and then all of a sudden it dawns on you that you've suddenly stumbled upon the answer, and this is it. This is what it is, and that turned out to be exactly true. That intuition, which it rang immediately, and that insight came that this is it, and that was it. That did turn out to be exactly true. That the pointing was true, the simplicity was true, the recognition was true. The intuition about what it meant turned out to be true. Now, I had maybe a few questions, and what about this and what about that? But it was all, at that point, suddenly in a new context, which was knowing and recognizing and being clear on what the whole essence of it truly was. And that was that was very important, and it was just because of the directness and of the pointing, and of course the presence of that reality. Without that reality, that you could point forever, but if there was no reality to point to, that wouldn't be much use.
Yeah, and when it's pointed out, that it doesn't become, because it already is, the context of all contexts.
Mm-hmm.
The paradigm-less paradigm, so to speak.
I mean, another pointer there would be that without which there can be nothing else.
Yes. Or I think Nisargadatta said, that by which I know that I am.
Exactly.
And that's that.
Yeah, and that's, yep.
And that's that.
That's that.
And I think we've
Well,
got
that's probably a good place to wrap.
Yeah, so John, as always, thank you and thank you. It has been really sublime to be with you in this way. It's a huge privilege and a great joy, and much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. I've enjoyed sharing with you, and I've really enjoyed your pointers and your insights too. I think that they also are very clear, and people are getting a lot out of your contributions. So, and I am too. So, thank you for that.
Well, it's a great partnership, and as we say, there's no I in team. Bottom line, as always, I love you. Somebody asked me once, why do you tell me that you love me? You don't even know me. I said, well, the only thing I can tell you is I love you because I love you.
Exactly.
Can't explain it. I just do.
Yep. I love you too, Charlie. Feels good to express it.
It is good. It's a wonderful declaration, isn't it?
Well, what else is worth saying,
Really. This ends the podcast number 6 with John Wheeler. We do recommend that you listen to at least podcasts 1 through 3 if you haven't already done so, as they will give you a foundation that builds a really solid base for this one. Getting the basics down is essential in seeing this clearly. Thank you so much for your listening. I love you.